love this, Jew.
I love you too.
Awesome.
We're train bound.
Go ahead.
Train bound?
Train bound?
Train bound?
The Virginia Truckee Rail Line.
That's right.
Railroad, whatever.
That's right.
Steam engine, number 29. Yeah. There's St. Mary's.
St. Mary's of the Mountains.
Yes, St. Mary's of the Mountains. More trains. More trains.
If you're watching me right now, I'm pointing off to my left, not trying to poke your eye out, but right over there to the left, 1,000 yards east, is a huge pile of dirt. Now that's a dead giveaway. It's a very deep mine. In fact, in 1875, it was the deepest mine in the world, 3,265 feet deep. It's the combination mine, and they called it that because it was a joint venture of 4 individual mining companies. Now you're not going to believe this, but I promise it's true. Every day they had to pump 1 million gallons of water out of that mine just so they could keep going deeper and deeper. Right over there is the first place they ever tried steel safety cages. Prior to that, they would just pack all the miners into a great big ore bucket, tell them to hang on for dear life, and then just start dropping them down into the mine. Hey, what could go wrong? That's why we have everybody stay seated right there. Also, over in the combination, that's the first place they tried experimenting with something called compressed air drilling. It was a huge success. The miners loved it because they no longer had to stand in that old hot mine and keep swinging that pick all day long. Also right over there is where flat wire cable was first tried out. They loved that too. Made it so much easier to get those big ore buckets up out of the bottom of the mine. Right here just to the east of us, this steel building is the Comstock Gold Mill, one of the very last mills built up here. Here comes that wooden trestle that I told you about. The trestle was put here because there were mines on both sides of the tracks, and this allowed the miners to push their little hand ore cars right over to the center of the tracks and then dump them down into the big cars of the V&T. There were 2 young superintendents working in these mines, John Mackey and his very dear friend James Fair. They grabbed 2 other good old Irish lads, and the 4 of them went uptown, and they very, very quietly began to purchase old abandoned mines all around the consolidated Virginia. 30 days later, in Yukon, Virginia, they would discover what everybody began to call the Big Bonanza. They found a ledge of silver ore that was 40 feet thick, set a world record. It still has the record for the largest ore strike in the world. Well, the price of ore, silver I should say, had been assaying out at about $8 per ton. All of a sudden the price skyrocketed to almost $1,100. John Mackey became one of the wealthiest men in the world overnight. He and his 3 partners were no longer known as the Irish Big Four. They really liked their new nicknames, the Bonanza Kings or the Silver Kings. Now Mackey was very influential in the construction of both the transatlantic and trans-Pacific cable lines. If you are familiar with Reno, you know we have the University of Nevada up there on the hill, and of course we have the Mackey School of Mines up there, permanently endowed because of all that Mackey money. And this fall you can go up there, sit down and watch a football game in the friendly confines of Mackey Stadium. Money just keeps going. Right there is where our yard is, and that's exactly where it was way back in 1869. We're going under a little water tower here. Unfortunately, it is not like the one at Petticoat Junction. There's a little hole in the ground right here, almost underneath our coach tracks, and that's 1,700 feet deep. It's the Julia Mountain. It's named for the internationally famous Julia Boulay. Now, she was the first, and actually one of the few ladies of the evening up here. No pun intended, she was so well loved by the people that at one point they made her the honorary battalion chief of the Warren Engine Company, probably the most famous firehouse uptown. There was a time when about 100 of the miners all got sick because of some bad water. Julia took every one of them into her home and nursed them all back to health, and she was even more beloved after that. Sadly, the day of her funeral, dignitaries came from all over the world to pay their last respects, and Julia unfortunately met a very early demise. Following the little horse-drawn hearse as it slowly made its way out to the cemetery north of town, were about 500 of the saddest looking miners you've ever seen in your life. We have just entered our first tunnel. Well, it's no longer a tunnel. It used to be a tunnel. It was a beautiful little tunnel, 97 feet long. This was tunnel number 5 in a series of 8 for the original B&T. When the highway department built the truck route up here, they came along and dynamited the roof off that tunnel so they could put that little permanent steel crossing in place. The truck route is the highway you see all the way to the east over there, about the same elevation we are. That is Nevada State Route 341, and every year we close it for 3 days and we have a car race on it. The event is called the Virginia City Hill Climb, and you have to make a real fast lap up and then an equally fast lap coming back, and then they average the 2 times. Last year's winner was a woman driving a red Ferrari Spider, and she was just a blur on that little highway. She was incredible. Right here on both sides of the tracks we have 2 of our state trees. We have the pinyon pine, and then we have the mountain juniper. And this year, I think, we have probably the most beautiful display of our state flower that I think I've ever seen. It's called the Artemisia tridentata. Don't waste a second trying to find out where it is down there. That's a fancy name for sagebrush. Now, the pinyon pine offered up the staple for both the Washoe and Paiute Indian diets in the form of pine nuts. Anybody tell me what we still make with pine nuts? Pesto, absolutely right, pesto. Why do we harvest juniper berries? What do we get? Gin. Well, you guys got 1 out of 2. Now I'm going to try and describe what life was like for the miners. Ready? Horrible. That's it. Every one of the mines had air temperatures of 140 degrees, and they all had way too much of that subsurface water, and the water temperature was 190. Because of those 2 elements, those poor guys could only work 15 minutes, and then they would just kind of collapse somewhere, and if they were lucky, somebody would douse them with a bucket of water, and then they'd go right back to work. Sometimes they did that 6 days a week, because at the end of every shift they could go uptown and they would be paid $4, made them the highest paid miners in the world. Up here, you could buy a great steak dinner with dessert for 75 cents. You could also buy an entire gallon of old tub whiskey, part of the original Jim Beam brand, 15 cents. If you really, really wanted a fresh hot bath once a week, that was only $1. Any way you cut it, if you could survive the day job and make it safely back up to the street level at night, there was a ton of money left over. You could go have a real good time. Tunnel 4 is clear. We are now entering our second tunnel of the day. This is actually our first real tunnel. This is tunnel number 4. Nothing confusing about that. Look at the walls of this tunnel. Now, when they were digging the tunnel, they didn't have any explosives. This was all done by hand with picks and shovels. And somehow, they were able to average 18 inches a day. That was record speed. Now here's another little fun fact about Tunnel 4. It is the home to a bobcat and 2 cubs. It's another real good reason for keeping those hands inside the cars, right? Once we clear the tunnel right over here to the west, kind of paralleling our tracks, and actually running up over the top of the tunnel, you're going to see a little dirt road. That is part of the original wagon toll road up to Virginia City. That used to connect all the way over to Placerville, California. Now, in just a minute, we are going to go past tunnel number 3, and sadly, we will never, ever go through tunnel 3. We tried for 2 years to open it up and just couldn't do it. The ground is just too unstable. It actually was a nightmare for the original B&T. They would run their trains right down to the tunnel entrance, and they would stop. The crew would get out and run inside and begin to shore up some of the big sagging timbers, and then they would quickly shovel off the tracks any rocks and debris that had fallen down. Sometimes if they had passengers on the train, they would actually ask them if they wanted to help. I think the standard answer was probably no. No, I don't think so. If you just look past these trees, you'll see what's left of tunnel number 3. Well, that means we are forced to take a permanent detour, or what we call a shoe fly, around the tunnel. Still continues to fall in a little bit more all the time. Well, this shoe fly does let us get all the way down into Gold Hill, and there are still some very prominent buildings you're going to see down there. The first one you're going to notice is the long sloping steel roof of the Crown Point Mill, and it sits directly beneath the famous Crown Point mine. When you get home, go on YouTube, look up Crown Point Mill, Gold Hill, Nevada, and they're going to show you the inside of that mill, and then they explain how they extracted all the gold and silver. It's pretty interesting stuff. The next famous building, the Gold Hill Hotel and Saloon, one of the finest of the Old West and the longest in continuous operation in the state of Nevada. They actually opened with a great big tent back in 1859. That was before Nevada was Nevada. They've had a real long time to perfect the Bloody Mary, and they've done it. The last famous building down there, the one with the red brick facing facade, is where the Bank of California used to be. Wish you could have seen the size of the vault they had in that little bank. Within 3 months of completing their railroad here, the boys of the bank enjoyed a profit of $400,000 every month. That's a prosperous little short line railroad. Can you think? I bet with that kind of money we could each fill up our tanks with gas.
Yeah.
Well, maybe all of us.
I don't know, I got a Hemi.
There's a little bell right here. One should notice that as we go by. I'm going to have a trick question for you in just a minute. That little bell used to hang above the Liberty Firehouse that was located just down the highway a couple of blocks. Here's the trick question. What happened to the Liberty Firehouse? No, it
Burned
did not
down.
burn.
Damn.
That was the trick part. Actually, one day high wind just blew it over. Had you been here last Sunday, you would not have doubted that one bit. 80-mile-an-hour wind.
Wow.
Here's the trees and bushes I promised. They get a little closer to us every week. And way back up there is where the very first gold discoveries were made back in 1869. That's how the area finally became known as Gold Hill. You know, while those miners were desperately searching for that gold, they had to continually work around that thick blue mud. It was a mess. It stuck to their boots. It stuck to their tools. It completely ruined their little rocker cradles, jammed up their sluice boxes. They just kept shoveling it off to the side. And then they realized that once it dried, it became as solid as concrete, so they started taking it uptown. They began to fill in some of the potholes in the streets of Virginia City with it. Then one day, some much more experienced Mexican miners came through here, and they looked at that stuff that was being thrown away, and then they kind of looked at each other, and then one of them said, "Mucha plata," which loosely translated to, "Why are these idiots throwing away all that valuable silver?"
No.
Well, guess what happened late that night? Those potholes began to reappear uptown. Now we're going to stop here for just a minute. Several famous mines right here in Gold Hill. For example, about 600 yards south of us, down the tracks, is the famous Belcher mine. Real close to the tracks. In fact, it is literally so close you can lean out the window and spit. Don't do that last Sunday. If you begin from the very mouth of the canyon and begin to work your way up this way, you pass the following famous mines. Now there's a lot more than I can mention, and we'd still be here on Tuesday. But you would pass the huge Leviathan mine, then you'd go by the Rock Island mine, and both the Chicago and New York mines are right down here. And then we're going to be getting pretty close to the famous Caledonia mine. Last but not least, the Trojan mine. You know what? We just passed another famous mine. Right back here on the side of the hill, can you see the big wooden ore chute? That is the famous Cane Tuck mine. I did not say King Tut. It's the Cane Tuck. Anywhere else they would have called it the Kentucky mine. Well, the Cane Tuck is where John Mackey and his partners actually got their first little sliver of ownership in a mine. Here's how they did it. First, they worked the 8-hour shift and they got the $4. Then they worked another 8-hour shift. And this time they were paid in what was called feet. Every mine had so many feet to it. Now that didn't have anything to do with the depth. A foot, as they called it, was one share of ownership. Well, Mackey and his partners worked very hard. Didn't take long. They became owners of the Cane Tuck. So, like most new business people, the first thing they did was fire about half the crew, which meant they all had to work harder, and they did. 6 months later, almost exactly 200 feet deeper, they found nothing. They were dead broke. They couldn't even borrow money. Well, they decided to come back one more day, maybe because the next day was New Year's Day. By mid-afternoon of the next day, they suddenly hacked their way into a huge cavern. This was an area roughly 20 by 25 feet. Much bigger than any mine shaft. The cavern was completely full of quartz crystal. And the quartz was full of gold and silver. They were off and running. Over the next 3.5 years, that little tiny mine right there yielded up $8 million in gold and silver. John Mackey died in 1901 at the ripe old age of 87. At that time, he was worth $149 million. You know what that would be today? Take a big deep breath, I'll tell you. 68.7 billion, as in Jeff Bezos, billion dollars. And promised Mackey would never have wasted any of it trying to send somebody to space. Someday maybe Jeff Bezos will ride this little train with us. Mackey and his wife actually were very generous, very magnanimous. They did a lot of good things with all that money. Well, probably the most famous mine of the whole area is right here below us. You see that structure down there has the two big steel wheels on the top of it? Looks like it's been covered in concrete. Well, the steel wheels are actually part of the hoist mechanism. And that concrete looking stuff is gunite to protect the big timbers from rotting. That is the Yellow Jacket Mine. All of its fame and notoriety came as a result of a terrible accident that happened April 9th, 1869. A fire broke out 800 feet above where the miners had gone to work. Long story short, 38 miners died in that fire. Believe it or not, the fire burned continuously for 3 years. People don't believe that. It's the absolute truth. Here's how it could do that. I only mentioned a handful of the famous mines here, but there were so many mines, and they were so close together, they would intersect with each other several times as they kept going deeper and deeper. Because of that, they could never successfully shut off the oxygen supply. They tried. They temporarily closed some of the mines. Didn't make any difference. In fact, the fire spread to a couple of the other mines, but not nearly as dramatically as the Yellow Jacket. Finally, 3 years later, when it was safe enough to go back into the mine, of the 38 miners that went to work that morning, only 28 bodies were recovered. And that is still, fortunately, I guess, the worst mining disaster that we've ever had in Nevada's long history of mining. Okay, real quickly, how many of you are locals? Do we have any locals on the train with us? Well, you guys may know this anyway. Last summer, we had 2 huge fires. We had the great big Lake Tahoe fire. I didn't think they were ever going to get that one under control. At the same time, right over by Lake Almanor, we had that huge Dixie fire. Between the two of them, we had too many days, not every day, but too many days, we would pull down, stop right here, and it was so smoky, honestly, you could not see the hotel right down there.
I believe it.
Thick, gray smoke. Air quality index way above 650. I felt terrible for a lot of the people. They'd driven a long way. I couldn't show them any of this history. I finally just started making stuff up. You know, if you'd have been here Thursday, you could have clearly seen where the little unicorn ranch was, right? Man, it was bad. It was bad. Now, before we pull out of here, look diagonally across from us. See if you can see that thing. Looks like a steel door right between 2 great big rock walls.
Yes.
Somebody always wants to know what famous mine that is. That's the butcher shop. They dug back in there about 200 feet. That's all they had to do, keep all that fresh meat nice and cool all summer long. Now, just a minute. I'm going to introduce you to the newest. How'd you like to be taking a nap down there at the hotel? That'll work. I'm going to introduce you to the newest member of our rolling stock. Now, we just got this locomotive, the one we're going to go buy, about 3 weeks ago from the Santa Maria Valley Railway, somewhere in Southern California. It is a 282 wheel configuration. For anybody that care, I don't. But look at these wheels as we go by. They're little tiny wheels. My boss swears this locomotive, the number 100, is more mechanically sound than it is cosmetically beautiful. Okay, I hope so. Here she comes. He says we're going to have it running in 2 years. Now you're going to meet the newest little wrinkle in our adventure. That little shimmy is the result of an earthquake we had last night. But one little kink in the railway. That area we call it fraud. Can you tell we're going back on the road? hole in the mountain right here in front of us. It's all covered in black soot. That is proof that steam locomotives used to go through tunnel number 3. This is the other end of that black stuff. We love using this number 29 locomotive. Probably everybody's favorite. Not too long ago, we sent the 29 in 3 of our Pullman coach cars off to Pawhuska, Oklahoma, where they all starred in a Martin Scorsese film called Killers of the Flower Moon. Anybody read that book? Great book. Great book. Now here's a couple of names you might remember. Johnny Depp and Amber Heard are not in that movie. They may be appearing in a courtroom near you soon, but Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro are in the movie. I'm not going to give it away, but it is about the Tulsa, Oklahoma Indians, kind of what happened after all of that oil was discovered under their tribal land. All of this extracurricular noise is we have a student learning how to fire. This reconstructed railroad we're using is the lifelong dream of Robert Gray, and his name is painted proudly on the cab. Bob actually rode on the very last revenue train between Carson and Virginia City way back in May of 1938. He was only a teenager. He got out of the Marine Corps and he came up here and bought a little bit of old equipment, worked real hard to get it running, and then started laying track. Just in time for our bicentennial, 1976. He had the trains running again. This is our 46th consecutive year. Thanks to you.
That was really
nice to come out of that tunnel. All the way across the ravine, over on the top of the hill there where the gray rock is. That's the Foreman mine. It ceased operations way back in 1942. But we have recently watched them do a number of helicopter surveys of the mine, and they're bringing in new equipment all the time. That is the mine they're trying to open. Don't know what they're looking for, but they're very interested in something. Farther up the ravine, we're going to pass another little mine, and I call it the who cares so what, nothing to write home about mine. It's the Ward mine, and they dug it for 4 solid years, and they didn't find 1 ounce of anything valuable. And the only reason they kept digging was because that way they could keep selling totally worthless mining stuff. Most popular game on the Comstock. All of that stock fraud and manipulation is what established the city of San Francisco and their Board of Exchange. Let me give you one little example of how easily you can be cheated out of your hard-earned money. A mining superintendent would hear that they were finding some color down in the mine, so he would very happily send down a whole bunch of fresh food and a ton of ice-cold beer. Then he would lock the miners in, so nobody could come down and spread the word until he was able to make sure he could purchase every share of stock. Later, when the mine was played out, all that beer would come down the shaft again, and this time the owner would go back up there and sell off at a huge profit. All of that stock by morning was going to be totally worthless. Here's the Ward mine right there. Now, she wasn't the only culprit, but she certainly played a hand in some of that fraud. I think that's where the term getting the shaft probably originated. We're going to go back through tunnel 5. Going this direction, I think, opens up probably the most panoramic view we still have of Virginia City. For example, way out there ahead of us is that beautiful Catholic church, St. Mary's of the Mountains. On the other side of the tracks, way up here, about halfway up Sun Mountain, that huge, beautiful Fourth Ward School, one of the finest of the Old West, and the very first one to have indoor plumbing. Now, the church played a very important role in the history of Virginia City. Fires were all too common, but the fire that everybody called the Great Fire happened in October of 1875. The fire started early one morning way out on the north end of town, right between two little boarding houses. High wind had the fire quickly just racing this direction. Just before it got to the church, the city fathers came out and they begged Bishop Patrick Minogue to allow him to use that church as a fire break. And he said, okay, but you have to promise to rebuild it, and they did. Well, Mark Twain was writing for the Territorial Enterprise at the time, and he said, in what seemed like minutes, 70% of Virginia City had been destroyed, and the other 70% was on fire. He was a terrible mathematician. He was a pretty good storyteller. Actually, 90% was destroyed. 15,000 people were left homeless. But there was so much incredible wealth up here. Within 1 year, everything was completely rebuilt, including that church. Now, they want you to know you're all invited in, and they don't care what your beliefs are. They want you to come in and enjoy the beauty. I even have more incentive if you need it. They sell wine in the basement. Yeah. The Collar Mine is right here above us, and they have a great little tour if you want to get a good idea what miners we're up against. Stop and take that tour. On the other side of the tracks over here, you'll see a big fenced arena, and they've started putting up a bunch of grandstands all around it. That's where we are again going to have our famous camel races this summer. Now, we know you may not own a camel, so you can bring your emu, your ostrich, or even your zebra. We've had all of them. The only thing you do not need to bring, because we always have too many of these, and that would be jackasses. Every single year. I think it has to do with all the ice cold beer this summer. This little wooden trestle we have a lot of fun with during our holiday trains. We create an enchanted gnome forest right here. It's a lot of fun to go by at night. In just a minute, you're going to be able to look off to the east. You're going to see a little cone-shaped hill right out there in a little saddle. That's called Sugarloaf. That begins a 100-mile unobstructed view to the south and east. We're crossing back over F Street. Once we get beyond these few little homes and apartments on the hill, you're going to be able to see the back of the Mackey Mansion. It's beautiful, beautiful. John Mackey's wife, Marie, had the terrible job of having to travel all over the world and bring back whatever she wanted to furnish that mansion with. She brought back things that people had never even heard of, much less seen. It's a very popular place today for weddings and receptions. They have a great big gazebo up there, a very large outdoor dance floor. Last June, we had an entire wedding party on the train with us, including a beautiful blushing bride and a very handsome groom. They had their first fight before we ever got down to Gold Hill. Fortunately, by the time we got back up there once again, and hopefully they're still enjoying that wet as it is. Well, that means our little trip is over. We want to thank you guys